almost 5 years ago, I think it was very interesting interacting with our researchers and our investigators. And when most people were thinking I'm a saleswoman, and I was like, no. So, but this is the limit how most people have interacted with the pharmaceutical side of things, and so they're not familiar. So at Roche, I lead our clinical research operations department for Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm based out of our Nairobi office, so it's good to be home and be able to work from home. And at the same time, I also am a project lead with our Global Health Equity and Population Science team. And it surprised a lot of people to actually know that a pharmaceutical company has a global health department entrenched into the business of what we do, because we are a for-profit business. And I always start by this quote, which really inspired me back in 2021. And this was, just after the height of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, which we hope we don't see another one. Because there was so much to figure out, right? And life-changing. But I loved this because it really became the onus of a lot of conversation, but it also was the thinking at that time around private industry and big pharmaceutical companies as to what is the imperative, what is the ethical imperative, and how should business be done, especially in the R&D space and scientific excellence. So as a scientific community, we cannot continue to legitimize work that is not universally applicable when it has been clearly demonstrated that diversity is an attainable standard. And Daktari here actually already touched on these points in terms of the disparity, right? About Africa holding a quarter of the world's population, and a quarter of the world's burden of disease, but our representation in global data sets, our representation in research and development, in scientific thought leadership is negligible. So what you're seeing on the screen right now are some of the statistics that as a global health department within Roche, we really started putting together to call ourselves to a meeting, as we would say, and say, what are we doing and how are we doing it? And so one of the things that came out very strongly was that in the clinical research participants for most of the therapeutics that are developed, it is 8% of the global population that participates in there, and that 8% is from the global north, right? Yet when you look at the disparities, for example, amongst Black women and breast cancer as a topic, you have higher mortality in Black women compared to white women. But people are not really focusing on why, and that's where research comes in. So why aren't we answering these questions? At the same time, there's also a rapidly changing demographics, as we've talked about. So the global movement of people also means that people of mixed ancestry are going to come out quite strongly. Population dynamics in Africa is just growing. So the markets of tomorrow, who are they actually serving, right? If we're going to be making innovations, and if we're going to be making therapies that are supposed to work on people down to a very detailed scientific level, at a cellular level in our bodies, which is where technology is now, how are we going to say that this is actually applicable to everyone, yet the products are only being tested in a small minority of the world population? So just similar to that last slide, as I was saying, the patients of the future are also changing. So you have the world demographics changing, and it's postulated that by the end of this century that 80% of people will either be from India alone, not the whole of Asia, or Africa, right? And as well, they're not going to be a majority Caucasian population. The burden of disease is also changing for us. I always point out that we have, for a long time, concentrated on infectious diseases because that was giving us acute mortality, just killing us quickly. But now what we're grappling with in terms of the burden of disease is, who doesn't know somebody who has cancer today? It's like the thing that we don't want to hear. the thing that we're all doing changos for, in our WhatsApp groups. So the nature of also what is ailing us is changing, and so our healthcare system also has to evolve to address those issues. And markets and stakeholders, I think, are really changing, especially since the pandemic. It turns the world upside down. We can talk about the economy of today, but I don't want to delve into that. The point is, from a global standpoint, Africa is industrializing faster than any other region has in history. So the rapid change, digitalization of things, the change is pretty fast. Even nowadays, I feel old when I look at my nephew and how quickly the uptake. He's 12 of technology, how he just understands how apps work, and it's intuitive for him, yet for me, I'll still have to go to instructions to be like, what is happening? So the rate of change of the world of technology is moving much faster than ever in time before. And so stakeholders also started changing. Regulatory bodies around the world, from the FDA in the US, from the European Medicines Agency, to our own regulators here that have really matured, started asking tough questions. Is this therapy applicable to the population living here? Can you answer definitively yes or no? So the team that I work with for global health has a vision to that, ensure that the next era of transformational medicinal advances can benefit all patients worldwide. It shouldn't matter where you live for the outcome health-wise. And so the mission is to broaden the scientifically driven representation of understudied populations, which is where as Africans we sit. And that's in the clinical R&D and personalized healthcare space. So when I joined Roche, this data is a bit outdated, but I leave it there because this was our starting point. And African patients making less than 2% of global pharma studies, 17% of the total world population, but that has shifted. In about a decade, we'll be a quarter of the world population. We're having such a high burden of disease, yet in people's minds, we're still thinking only infectious disease, yet that is actually not true. And then for us, internally as an organization, we actually looked at, so where are the clinical research studies taking place? And, we got a big pushback saying, hey, we have Egypt, we have South Africa, and we're like, okay, yes, but what is the impact? What is that data telling us? Only to discover in 2020 that there were only 63 African patients enrolled. Roche is not only a producer of therapeutics. Roche is an organization that is more than 125 years old and has a pharmaceutical side, yes, for therapeutics, but also has a diagnostics division and invests 17 billion in R&D. So, and Dr. was talking about the amount of money it takes for an R&D process. That's how much an organization like Roche is developing in its pipeline of therapies and diagnostics. Yet out of that, representation from Africa was only 63 patients. I think that was just a pin drop silence moment in the room. And so that really catalyzed, what are we going to do about it? And so I worked with the global health team, and this was a commitment right from the leadership, from the CEO that was endorsed, that we are going to find the solutions. We're making a commitment as a global organization to advance inclusive research. Now, how that looks like at a local level, that's for the local teams to decide. So at an area Africa level, there was visions that were put together looking at a sustainable healthcare system, a more positive impact. Where could we make the impact? So access to innovative diagnostics. So it's not just medicines, because you need to be diagnosed correctly to actually get the right treatment, to actually to have the impact. So when you're looking at research to impact to commercialization, for us it's research to impact to access. And access means access to the whole healthcare continuum of what that patient may need. The research and development that we're doing then is focused on the African health needs and people. So Roche is one company. And if you're familiar with different pharmaceutical companies, they have their strengths. They are the ones that make antibiotics, and the ones that make painkillers and maybe toothpaste. Then, there's different disease areas. So what is actually applicable for an organization like Roche to bring to the Kenyan space, to the African space? Where does it make sense? There's no point in doing research just to get data to go and publish papers, right? What is it actually doing as an impact with? And then to look at the opportunities where we can bring a better balance between the healthcare capacity and the patient needs. And overall, so I really like this because that's already been discussed. How do we view healthcare as an investment that spurs innovation? Not as a cost, but as an investment into us, the population, the people, the entity that is actually driving the nation. So we looked at different ways that we could implement this. So whether it was working on ways to access to diagnostics and treatments, whether it was through R&D, whether it was building local capacity or investment in that innovation. So I'll pause here a little bit because this is the strategy that we have been working on in Kenya for the last 3 years and several African countries. And so this is what we did as a localization tool. Now to also bring you into a little bit more context, Roche develops its own therapies in disease areas where they've decided to focus as an organization. Primarily what Roche focuses on now is oncology. That's what I think anybody who works in a pharmacist or in a hospital, a clinical care setting knows Roche. It's the oncology drugs. But there's also a bunch of other NCD disease areas that Roche actually works in and develops diagnostics and therapies for. But for us, as the local team, we decided that R&D was really critical. And R&D was not just to generate data, as I mentioned, but we were going to take an approach that R&D was going to be a health system shaping tool. So how are we going to do that? I get asked by my former classmates, many of whom work for specialized research centers, why aren't you involved in your trials? And we have a very nice conversation, and I say, so your research center was built top of the range, high tech, right? With everything digital for infectious disease research, and it was built outside the healthcare system where patients are actually going to seek healthcare. So how do we make that link, right? And of course, tempers then come down because it's like, oh, I didn't think about it that way. So this is the first thing. Pillar number one is unlocking greater access for patients. Because patients who get enrolled in the clinical trial actually get that top level, right? The right way, the ideal setting. We're not talking about resource limited or anything, no. They're going to get from the diagnostics to the treatment exactly what should be in a textbook, ideal setting. So that's the opportunity for the patient at no cost to the patient. That's number one. But how are we going to unlock that access for the patient if we're expecting the patients to go and receive that care or seek that care somewhere that is so far from them or somewhere where it's not even their normal doctor, especially for a non-communicable disease where somebody is like, no, I want to go to a familiar space, right? I want to go to my clinic or my hospital that I know which corridor goes where and I'm not going to get lost. I know my doctors, I know my nurses, I even know the cashier, right? So that was number one. How are we going to unlock that greater access? Is actually targeting who are we going to work with and which are the researchers with the mindsets to understand that it has to have this particular impact as well. Number two is the skills and capability building. As I said, the protocols are an ideal setting, and they involve not only the researcher and the research team that is seeing a patient on a particular clinic thing, but if we're embedding the research in where our healthcare system actually is, that means every cadre, from laboratories to pharmacies to radiology to physiotherapy, they will get exposed to what the ideal should be. This then impacts what normal clinical care actually should look like. So it's like training on the job, right? But it also gives access to the same healthcare staff to be familiar with either advanced diagnostics or with these new therapies, so that it's not something that they're just seeing on TV or hearing about better outcomes for people in other parts of the world. The third bit, which I know will really interest researchers and innovators, is the science bit. So the opportunity to translate new scientific findings for African patients so as to optimize care. Roche has its own protocols for molecules it's developing. But Roche as a company also supports local researchers in two other ways. One, by supporting investigator-initiated studies, where you have a researcher that will come and say, I have an idea in this disease area that I know Roche is strong in or works in, right? And I'm looking for funding, right? So I think we've talked about skills for grant writing, etc., and things like that. That's the usual stream. The second other bit in supporting researchers directly, and this is where the intellectual and property is the researchers, right? The local researchers, is for early stage researchers, like the researchers at the Primate Institute. We have Institute Roche that looks for early stage researchers who have the ideas, and if the idea is viable, how do we partner? And by partnering is, there'll be some level of data sharing that will be available. However, the intellectual property right remains with the originator of the researcher. And then third is your typical phase 1, 2, 3 studies that you hear about where a pharmaceutical company is now developing the therapy or the diagnostic itself. So there's a range of ways to interact with pharma in the R&D space. But that science bit, I think it's really been untapped in the African space, again, because we don't have these collaborations and we haven't formed these relationships yet to really